good to go. So yeah, well, very fun to see some familiar faces on the screen, and nice to meet those of you who I have not been able to meet. I've a couple collaborators here as well, so that is always fun to see. And so yeah, I'm
Go ahead.
excited to just share a couple of thoughts that hopefully can stimulate some conversation um, today. And I titled mine this way because as I've been reflecting on some of the extreme contest texts that I've looked at, I inevitably end up trying to make an argument of how these extreme contexts are relevant to broader theory. And so I need to then make the argument about how it's not so extreme. And then as I've been thinking about that, I thought, well, hold on, actually, maybe some of the uh, traditional research, especially in the United States, in the entrepreneurship space and in management, maybe that's been a little bit outside of the norm. And so I kind of wanted to start today with a little bit of a different view, So we kind of have this notion of there can be this huge emphasis in entrepreneurship research on hunting for unicorns. So what are unicorns? Well, these are firms that achieve a $1 billion valuation, and this can be seen as the norm, like that we should be pursuing some of these. So just some data is a couple of years old, but some interesting data that it says, in the last 20 years, there have been 225,000 firms founded. 2,500 achieved a $1 billion valuation. So that's not revenue, that's not sales, that's a valuation. Less than 250 surpassed 1 billion, and then 15 or 0.7% of all unicorns generate more than 1 billion in cash and revenues. And so as we think about this, well, why is this important? Well, because those 15 firms generated 2.3 trillion in market value. So this is why we do focus on these in entrepreneurship research. And yet, as we see the trickle down here, it's really a tiny, tiny bit of firms. And so, one of the things that's motivated some of my more recent work is trying to think about the difference between raising money and actually generating value as a venture, and then what does that mean? What kinds of value? And so, I guess this is my opening salvo into this is where in my field, I've often heard, well, how come you're studying such unusual things? And now I'm kind of flipping the argument and saying, well, actually, I feel like I'm studying some more normal things, but that perhaps are just not as commonly studied in our theories. And so I'll expand on that a little bit. And the picture is even worse than that, I guess, a little bit. Some of these kind of emerging unicorns, many of them are not cash flow positive for quite some time, and so this can be a pretty big challenge. Is that these suck up a lot of financial resources in terms of investment with such a small number, and then again, just how this can take some time. For them to scale as well. So these are some of, I guess I'm starting with these are some of the most common variables that I've seen in my field as being the focus, and yet it's very, very few firms that achieve this. And so as I kind of start out and thinking about, well, what is extreme? And so one of the first things that I have is, extreme to whom? So extreme can be in the eye of the beholder. So I have some, images distracting you on the screen, perhaps. But for some, these are normal behaviors, normal activities. For others, these are extreme. And so it can be our notion of what's extreme in terms of resource constraints, availability, what's possible, what's impossible. Um, and then there becomes this challenge of translating that extreme to the mundane. Like, how do we find theoretical generalizability from our findings so that we can actually contribute to lots of different kinds of conversations? And one thing as well is, when we think about the extreme, for one person, somebody else's moral foundations or goals or processes, um, or even outcomes of entrepreneurship can be dramatically different across contexts. And this is why it's so valuable to look at these extremes. And so, for example, is necessity entrepreneurship more extreme than chasing unicorns when, necessity entrepreneurship might be one of the most common types of entrepreneurship that we see across the entire globe. And so I think one of the challenges we face in this domain of research is both we find these contexts, I find them personally extremely interesting, and then now trying to translate that into other conversations. So I just wanted to share a couple of thoughts on this, and also kind of in the spirit of the broader theme around recovery and some of these instances, and just trying to highlight how I've been trying to think about some of the novel contexts, more extreme contexts, and then what I'm hoping to shed light on for other kinds of conversations. And so we'll see how many of these I get to. I have slides, but mostly so that I can show pictures because I like to show pictures and I find them to be more interesting. So the first is in a war context, and I'm grateful that my collaborator Ramzi Patala is on the call for this particular set of projects that we've been working on. But as we think about some of the challenges to peace more recently, this kind of this quote here paints a picture about yes, this war is considered an extreme context, I would say, but yet it's impacting many people. So 6 out of 7 worldwide are plagued by feelings of insecurity, facing the highest number of violent conflicts since the Second World War. 2 billion, quarter of humanity live in places affected by such conflict. And so, yes, it's extreme, but yes, I mean, 2 billion people. That's slightly generalizable. I would argue, right? Like that's a lot of people who are trying to operate in these contexts. And so as we think about, here's some more data on this too. The Global Peace Index says the world's kind of at this crossroads. North America has seen some regional deterioration as well. Also, minor conflicts translating into major conflicts, and then refugees displaced, and so um, significant challenges. And so one of the things that we've looked at in these contexts is how do people manage the space that they're living in. And so in traditional literature, both in professional literature, professional identity, and professional work, we've looked at this liminal space, this in between two knowns. But what we've been finding is in some of our research is, well, it's not just this liminal space, but there's a limbo. Like where I've come from is destroyed and disabled, and where I'm going is completely unknown. And I've lost these, holding environments that gave meaning to my work, gave meaning to what I do. And so as we think about traditional literature on other concepts of career change or entrepreneurial failure or some of these different kind of challenges where we're going from one known state to another known state, this is quite different and offers some opportunity for some novel theoretical contributions. So, kind of temporal questions, what can I create now and in the future? How relevant is my past? And then questions of place, how do I match an ever-shifting dynamic context? This kind of notion of chronic precarity, like I'm just never quite known where I am, how things are going to be. As I thought about this, I couldn't help but thinking of like this Harry Potter, like the shifting that you never know where the staircases are going to be. So how do you kind of map out where you're supposed to go? And so we've done some work in this space and tried to contribute to literature on entrepreneurial processes and just reimagining how those work. Um, and also like what is some of the outcome of this if firms cannot go through that normal process of that quote unquote normal process of trying to achieve rapid growth, then what is it that they can actually do? Like what does it actually create? Why are people doing these kinds of things? So I think it's given us a lot of interesting things. And as we were kind of continuing to build on that as well, it's shifted our thinking about what is the purpose of an entrepreneurial ecosystem? How does that impact people who are living in a war context? Traditionally, entrepreneurial ecosystems are thought as a vehicle to help create unicorns. I mean, I know I'm speaking overly broadly, but that could be one of the main focuses of entrepreneurial ecosystems. But what if it kind of generates other kinds of outcomes for founders as well as for the community? And so these are just some of the examples that we've seen from some of our data of entrepreneurs entrepreneurial actors who were launching ecosystems styled uh, structures for their community members, not just to learn about entrepreneurship, but also as a vehicle for providing hope and just overcoming the ongoing stressors of kind of this chronic precarity. Um, Okay, so this is like you're gonna. I should have warned you. You're gonna have some like hard pivots between these different contexts that I've studied. So we're going from there to what I call extreme successes in community. So there have been some trends in rural America. Um, I mean, I could go through all these charts, but the long short of it is it's not good, right? So things going badly. A lot of abandoned cities from you uh, the Rust Belt and other parts of the United States where industry has waned, and and this has kind of caused some real challenges, not only for business outcomes, but also just health and well-being of people. And so, I was previously in the Midwest for quite a few years, and noticed Midwest of the United States, and noticed that this was really a significant problem. But then also noticed that there was another group of people that seems to be kind of violating these trends. And so, in these exact same locations of extreme, sorry, of ruralness, that the Amish people were growing at exponential rates. And so, my collaborator and I thought this was quite interesting. Not only is the community growing and they're moving into some of these areas, but the Amish experience like a 95% success rate of their ventures. And so this is pretty dramatic. And so as we were trying to understand, well, what is going on here? Why is it that a community, and for those of you who don't know the Amish, a society of people who are really living with very anachronistic technology, one could argue, uh, you know, horse and buggy and some of those kinds of things. Why are they growing so well? And then why are they having so much success? One, the surrounding areas are under so much distress. And so, yeah, as we looked at that, looking also at the small business failure rates, why small businesses fail. We see some of these challenges here. And yet the Amish are at 95% surviving after 5 years. And so, one of the things found as we've been studying this phenomenon is a focus on profitability, not valuation, low overhead, low tech, simple business models, and then really it's an emphasis on community. Apprenticeship and smallness allows them to distribute a lot of the opportunities in their community, and then their work ethic, social capital, and then they found also financial ways for them to achieve an advantage. And so, um, by studying kind of this extreme phenomenon in the United States, where it's violating a lot of these norms as it relates to other kind of businesses, as well as communities, as well as just rural trends, we've been trying to understand some of the dynamics that make this possible. And so one of the things, kind of the theoretical areas we've been focusing on is just the tensions that exist within community and then organizations that are embedded in community. And so this is a literature within entrepreneurship that I've been exploring recently. And so on the one hand, communities provide resources and a shared identity, but then they can also drive homogeneity and kind of pressure the community. And as a result, as firms grow, growth can also challenge community. They might break out and fall out of the community, and that can negatively affect the community. And so we've kind of developed this notion of like a community identity moat. And so you think of a traditional moat, but then also like an economic moat that Warren Buffett in particular has talked about. And how do we protect those within our community and give them opportunities in novel ways? And so this has been one of the things that we've been trying to explore and theorize, and it's been difficult, frankly, to try to generalize some of these because the Amish are so unique relative to their non-Amish or what they call the English, all the rest of us neighbors. But what we are trying to identify is what are some of the processes that they use to ensure that their community is renewed so it can grow, and then also trying to balance the tensions that come with growth, both of individual organizations as well as some of the community members. So, okay, and so these have been kind of some of the emergent extreme cases that I've been looking at. And then another one that I've also more recently been looking at is what about historical adversity and how does that kind of reach from the past and continue to affect us into the present? And so what do I mean by this? Well, as a child, I grew up in this part of the United States. It's kind of called the Four Corners. You see these states meeting here, Four Corners, and this is the Navajo Native American Indian Nation. And as I would drive through this area, I just couldn't understand how people were surviving out here, like in the desert. And this is where some of the Native American nations were displaced too. By the colonizers. And so this was an interesting phenomenon. And then when I was living oh yeah, sorry, and then there are reservations all across the United States, uh, as depicted here. But then more recently, as I was living in upstate New York for a period of time, I drove by this massive casino and I was confused. I thought, what in the world is that? And it was a Native American casino, and these were popping up all over. And I thought, how do we go from uh, reservations to something like this in such a dramatic shift in economic opportunity? And so that's been something that we've been interested in. And this kind of gives you a picture of what it looks like right now. Uh, you know, Native Americans they're in the casino business. They currently operate the most casinos outside of Vegas and Atlantic City in the United States. And then they're continuing to explore innovative ways to expand to deliver uh, sustainable economic economies for their nations. And so you see just how massive this industry has been growing for the Native American tribes. And so as we've been looking at this, we've been trying to understand, well, how is it that a group of people that experienced such terrible historical trauma, went from 5 million in population down to just several hundred thousand at one point. How has that affected them over periods of time, and ultimately into modern day organizing practices? And so this is kind of trying to understand how do groups who've been affected uh, like long-term challenges and trauma reach into the present for them. And so one of the things that we have looked at and is trying to look at not only just the experiences of trauma that they had as a group of people, but also the differences in how they responded. And in particular, differences in responses of battles and the battling culture that they had, and how that battling culture is a reaction and response to adversity that can potentially be brought forward into modern day organizing and collaborating. And so again, this is trying to understand not only just how negative things impacted individuals, but also how they reacted and responded to that. So there's lots of research on that, of course, in psychology, with resilience and this kind of two side of the coin. But we're trying to look at this as well as it relates to historical trauma experienced by groups. So we're kind of noting how venturing could be this new battlefront, and so and these kind of modern fights. And we've collected a lot of secondary data as well as in the process of doing interview data as well, and noting how these Native American tribes really monetize their culture of games of chance, well-trod pathways of exchange with outsiders, and have just continued to find creative ways to find resources that support their communities and their economies. And this is somewhat similar to this concept we see in Jamaica with the Maroons or these individuals who fled slavery into the mountains. And then over many, many years, continued to survive outside of mainstream Jamaican society. And for those of you who are fans of reggae music or even Jamaican sprinters and some of the Jamaican sport, often harken back to uh, this fight that their historical ancestors fought, and how it continues to inspire what they are doing in the here and now. And so with that, I'm actually going to skip my last one because I was overly ambitious about what I thought I could share in a short period of time. But I just wanted to kind of conclude by just saying, as we kind of ask about who is this extreme to, I think that that can help us find interesting novel contexts that are indeed extreme to a certain audience, and then we can also then say, but wait, hold on, but this is also generalizable to a certain audience, and that can help us as we're moving toward some of those theoretical contributions. And then how is it that we can then really try to tease out the unique aspects of our theoretical contribution that push and alter and change and enhance current theoretical understandings that might be just anchored in an empirical context that's pretty narrow. And in my case, with entrepreneurship, that's focused on unicorns. Okay, so with that, I'm going to stop because I really want to make sure we get to Joanne as well and her great work. So thank you for.
Today is really just talk about, I suppose, just some of the actual experiences, the realities of doing research around those environments and what it is. And I want to, I suppose, in a similar way to Trent, I want to draw on some of the work that I've done in various environments and a number of projects in particular. So I suppose for me, that's about looking at how we dimensionalize the challenges that are, they're very real
Bonjour.
difficulties and challenges that are associated with extreme contexts.
Oh,
And also also how we begin to think about how extreme contexts operate within a number of different environments. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about some work that we have done with victims and survivors of conflict in terms of legacy processes post-conflict, some of the issues around organizational leadership, particularly within business environments who are operating within conflict zones and environments coming out of conflict, and then what actual individual leadership sometimes looks in an extreme context. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the sort of peace building, conflict transformation practices that I've kind of seen recently. Like Trent, I have a lot of pictures, okay, in terms of my slides. So I might, as we go through, just explain some of these pictures to you. I didn't want to be, I know I'm kind of doing a lot, so I didn't want to be jumping around sort of conflict zones too much in terms of what I was doing. So what I've tried to do is to think about conflict in an environment that I know very well, and that's the situation that we've been dealing with for certainly most of my lifetime in Northern Ireland. And so, oh, I think I've just lost my slides. I don't know what's happened there. So most of these pictures, most of the stuff that I'm going to talk to you about is about conflict within Northern Ireland, and particularly the conflict that most of us would refer to as the Troubles, which lasted in Northern Ireland from about 1969, although there's very little agreement on really when it happened, until the Belfast or Good Friday Agreement in 1998. And the picture, I suppose, in the first slide that you're looking at is a picture that anybody who has any awareness or association with Northern Ireland will recognise immediately. It's the newspaper headline on the day of the IRA ceasefire. And so that's the kind of, you can see in that picture just the sort of level of concern and what a huge, enormous thing it was. And we return to some of that. So I suppose firstly, I want to talk to you just a little bit about some of these methodological challenges that we have when we're trying to work within these environments. And I said at the beginning that we had been involved recently in a kind of research and impact project around with victims and survivors of violent conflict, and some of the difficulties and challenges that created for us in terms of our relationship with those participants as also members of the same society that they were in. And I think whenever I was listening to Trent earlier, I just think he made a really important point that you have to recognize what extreme means for who and what you're actually talking about. And I think if people grow up within particular environments, if that's the environment they live in, we have to recognize that that actually isn't extreme, it's just normal life. That this, for many people running organizations, many people trying to build businesses, dealing with something like conflict or an extreme context is everyday reality. It's not an unusual circumstance. And I just think that's a really kind of important point. So if we sort of take that as a position, we, myself and my colleagues, were in an environment where we were going in to speak to victims and survivors of paramilitary conflict in Northern Ireland. And we were also from Northern Ireland. So we were people that absolutely understood those concerns and understood to some extent their experiences. And of course, as has been mentioned previously, their trauma in relation to what had happened to them. So we came up against a whole series of issues in relation to that. The first one of those was this huge issue around positionality. And again, the picture that you can see within this slide is something which I would have been very familiar with in my childhood. So a normal everyday occurrence with a soldier at the corner of your house. So so we were faced with the reality that as researchers and scholars within this area, we were occupying multiple positions. So we were insiders, but we were also outsiders in terms of these experiences, because Northern Ireland is, of course, a divided society. And we were identified immediately by all of the people we spoke to in relation to our community affiliation, or what people regarded our community affiliation as being, I should say. So that, in itself was really important. Sorry, I keep losing my slides here. I'm not sure what's happened. But so that issue of positionality was really kind of key for us, and we can maybe talk a bit more about that in a second. So, and another kind of big issue that we had was this challenge of trying to occupy multiple roles within that research and impact process. So we had to be extremely careful in terms of how we presented ourselves, how we referred to ourselves, the words that we used to refer to the communities that we came from. One of our researchers had a particular issue in terms of her accent, because her accent and her surname identified her in terms of her community. And that became very obvious in some of the sessions that we ran with participants. And so there were all of these issues that arose in terms of what we might call code switching and masking in terms of our own identity, and the difficulties that researchers face whenever you're trying to research a context that you understand well, with all of the depth that's involved in that, but of course the perceptions that are associated around it as well. One of the other kind of really interesting kind of issues that we encountered was just the access process in terms of how we were able to reach participants. And that access process, was usually facilitated by us, for us by intermediaries. And very often those intermediaries were boundary spanners who we had a relationship with, an existing relationship with, but who had a trusted relationship with the communities that we were trying to access. So that really at times was quite a difficult, delicate process, where individuals on our behalf were exercising their own reputational capital, but we were also trying to do the same in some really quite contested and sometimes environments, it has to be said, that didn't feel all that physically safe, certainly didn't feel psychologically safe, but actually sometimes didn't feel particularly physically safe either. One of the other kind of difficulties associated with that very basic issue of safety are issues around where we met people. Now we obviously had funding for this project, and that funding covered venue hire and sort of, things like lunches and dinners for participants. But very often groups were reluctant to go to venues that they didn't know. They wanted to meet us in places where they felt very familiar. Very often those venues were not what we might call neutral venues. So they were venues often which had very specific associations in relation to things like previous paramilitary atrocities, previous state atrocities, um, venues that had real resonance in relation to the conflict itself, and some places which were really uncomfortable. In one instance, we met a group in an environment which immediately all of us felt very uncomfortable in because it was pretty desolate and barren and quite a difficult space, which was clearly on an interface. So it was an area between two quite divided communities. And it transpired during the course of the event that the reason why the community occupied that space was because a number of people had been murdered in that building, you know, which, kind of gives people pause. It gives you pause when you're kind of sitting there thinking, okay, well, that's quite a space to occupy. And it was very important for them, but clearly not a very comfortable place to be in as a researcher as well. And then this idea of kind of entering the unknown. Very often, you're going into environments that you just don't know very well. You're going to meet people who, at times you're not actually sure who you're meeting. So, you're meeting people who have a history in terms of, the conflict or the extreme context that you're in, that you're talking about, but you don't really know what their association is. So, very often we would go in to meet groups. We had a presentation ready for them to tell them about the work that we were doing. And on one occasion, one of the pictures that we were using in our presentation was a picture which was taken off a BBC website. And it was about a sort of victims' legacy process. But some of the people within the picture were also in the room, which we did not expect. So these are sometimes very, very very difficult, complex environments, and you're really having to be very quick off the mark as a researcher in terms of managing some of the kind of intricacies of that. We also had a situation recently which we'd never encountered before, where one group actually brought their psychologist with them, which I just thought was kind of fascinating in terms of the kind of trauma process. And of course, it shouldn't be underestimated just how traumatic some of these conversations are, how traumatic for them, but actually also, quite difficult for us as well. And this is sometimes quite emotionally draining research. There's no point really, pretending it's anything else. I should say in terms of some of the pictures, I realize I'm kind of moving through some of these pictures without maybe explaining them. We just flick back one. Some of these pictures are a little bit traumatic as well, so I sort of apologize in advance. I should have said that at the start. So if you don't like it, turn off your screen. If you're concerned about anything like that, please do feel free not to look at the pictures. But all these pictures are publicly available, and actually most of them are incredibly well known in terms of the Northern Ireland conflict. This picture on your screen at the minute is during an event called Bloody Sunday. There's been now 2 public inquiries. The person who is leading the group of people is a priest, soon to become a bishop, and the sort of white and red thing in the middle is a dying young 17-year-old boy. So that's a very, very famous, emblematic picture of a very difficult day in the history of a city called Derry in Northern Ireland. And the picture on this slide, if any of you have Disney, watching Disney, this is a new Disney program called Say Nothing, which relates to the murder of a woman at the bottom of your screen, mother of 10, Jean McConville, who was tortured, murdered and disappeared by the IRA at the very beginning of the Troubles. And again, if you want to know more about that story, Say Nothing is actually, in fairness to it, a very interesting, accurate representation of what happened in relation to that case. If you haven't read the book and you're interested in conflict environments, I would highly recommend the book. It is by a New Yorker journalist called Patrick Radden Keefe, and is probably the best thing written about the conflict in Northern Ireland, bizarrely, I have to say. In fairness to him, he's an American, and we didn't think we would ever say that, but he's got to be given credit kind of where it's due. So we're kind of moving on. One of the other things that we kind of encountered was the difficulty of really kind of hearing about and navigating what is really sensitive, difficult material, just in the reality of dealing with that material. Some very difficult and actually barely legal conversations in relation to things like collusion. So the engagement of police and army with paramilitary groups. is, came up repeatedly in some of the conversations, that we had. One of the things that we found incredibly interesting in this research recently that we'd never seen before, and very many of us have been doing this work for a long time, was a sort of an emergence of almost conspiracy theory related material. And I think there's probably a much greater conversation around kind of social media and conspiracy material generally, but it's definitely seeping into other environments. And we had not expected that when we did this piece of work, but that was quite an interesting and unusual thing. So those are sort of some of the experiences we had in terms of the actual research process around dealing with something like this. This is another, I have to say, a very, very difficult picture. A soldier who's been stripped, tortured, and murdered by the IRA in West Belfast. This came at the end of probably one of the worst weeks in the history of Northern Ireland, where there had been a series of deaths. A number of IRA volunteers murdered in Gibraltar by the British Army. Then a number of people murdered in a cemetery, attending the funerals of those volunteers who had been murdered in Gibraltar. And then these two soldiers murdered who strayed into the funeral cortege of the people who were murdered in the cemetery. I hope you're keeping up in terms of these deaths. And so this, I suppose, gives you all these pictures again, publicly available. They're very, very well known. This was a headline picture in terms of the news worldwide whenever it happened. So I'm not sure it's awful, but it was very common, unfortunately. So this is the reality of people's lives and the reality that people's lives were living during this period of conflict. So why are we interested in this? Well, we're interested in it because it gives us, as we know, an opportunity to research phenomena, which is really hard to get to. I would say the reason why we are very interested in extreme context research from an organizational point of view is that conflict and peace building are organizational phenomena as well as they are community phenomena and political phenomena, but we tend not to see them as organizational phenomena. And so while peace building, for example, and peace agreements may be enacted politically or maybe agreed politically, they are enacted organizationally. And so I've done a lot of work with police services, for example, and there is nowhere where peace building is enacted more clearly than in policing environments, post conflict processes. So I'm sort of conscious about time as well, and I just want to mention two kind of additional things. One of I suppose, whenever we do this work and we go through all of these difficult processes and we try to navigate the challenges of that, we of course end up, as Trent, demonstrated so wonderfully, we end up with some kind of outcomes. And I suppose for me, in terms of the research that I've done on this to date, I see two sets of kind of interesting things that we might want to talk about. The first thing are the kind of organizational practices that we see within extreme contexts in relation to the navigation of conflict, but also the way in which people build peace. And again, we don't have time today to go into these in detail, but things like framing, for example, and we did a piece of work on kind of framing sort of in conflict environments, particularly reframing as a conflict transformation mechanism, was published a while ago in the British Journal of Management. Issues around boundary spanning, issues around the establishment of norms in terms of people who are working in these environments, personal security, networks, the creation of boundaries, all of those kind of processes, circles of trust, building capacity, and promoting relevant talent within organizations. A lot of these kind of organizational practices are drawn from some work we've done in policing, but also a big piece of work that we've just finished with international diplomats working in conflict as well. Issues around managing morale, this wonderful phrase, developing a duty of hope, comes from the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs. And then really, something that I think we don't talk about nearly enough, the exercise of courage, political courage, psychological courage, but also we have to remember physical courage, the reality that people are going into incredibly difficult, dangerous environments and dealing with those environments in ways that shows a level of bravery which we forget far too quickly, far too soon. And then what I wanted to kind of finish on, and I'm sort of conscious, I'm sort of rushing through things, it's just a sort of recent piece of work I've done, which is actually one of the outputs from the piece of work with diplomats. It's work because I think, I mean, I'm a professor of leadership, you know, that's kind of what I do. And so I'm really interested in leadership and also leaders, two different things, you know, and how, and I think the biggest leadership challenge that we face as a society and as a world is how we navigate these very intractable, wicked conflicts. And goodness knows we are seeing more of these conflicts. We're seeing a deepening of these conflicts rather than a lessening of them. So we really better get some handle on the kind of things that help us to do them. I just did a piece of work because one of the things that was kind of annoying about the diplomat project was that all the diplomats just wanted to talk about one person, and that person was, or certainly as far as the Irish diplomats were concerned, they just wanted to talk about one person, and that was this extraordinary person called John Hume. And Hume was, I suppose, is now regarded as the sort of father of the Northern Ireland peace process, the man who built the peace, as he was referred to in the Irish Times on the day of his death. And within that piece of work, we were able to disaggregate a number of practices, I think, that Hume as an individual was involved in, of course, with very many others at different times, to try to unlock what was the wicked conflict of the Northern Ireland conflict, which is, I suppose, what I've been talking to you about today. And those practices, again, you know, things like this incredibly powerful reframing of the conflict away from a zero-sum game towards a totality of relationships, towards three sets of relationships between Britain and Ireland, the Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, and then within Northern Ireland itself, you know, stakeholder cultivation, particularly in terms of America, the absolute strategic importance of America to unlocking the problem, opening up linguistic space in a way that others hadn't, you know, actually creating linguistic space, rhetorical space for peace building, which just wasn't there previously, you know, in a kind of annoying way. Anyone that knows anything about sort of history of conflict in Ireland will say that Hume became a kind of single transferable speech. But actually, you know, he stopped using that language when the rest of us started. So, you know, everybody else, and now that's the language everybody uses, you know, taking the gun out of Irish politics, et cetera, et cetera. You know, the idea of practicing disruption, you know, actually introducing disruption into environments in a way which a lot of the time was seen as really unhelpful. And disruption at that point, and this is where courage really kind of comes in. Disruption at that point was often about things like talking to paramilitary leaders when nobody else would. So actually doing things that people really balked at and were enormously risky in terms of, you know, his political party and his reputation. And then I think the most important thing, and of course this builds on all sorts of other work that exists in conflict and leadership more generally, but just the acceptance of sacrifice, you know, the need sometimes to realize that in order to achieve great things, you have to make great sacrifices. You have to live with the tension and the difficulty of doing those things for long periods of time with no guarantee of success. So that's probably all I want to say, just in terms of giving you a bit of a run through of some of the sort of work I do. I always feel like a bit of an imposter in terms of the extreme context community, because some people, you know, you're all doing such extraordinary work, and it's very obviously, you know, focused on some of the sort of theoretical and empirical contributions, but I'm kind of sitting in this conflict space, you know, so I deal with it slightly differently.